Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you all for joining this Exploring Research seminar, The Blind Teacher Today. I'm Declan, and I'll be chairing this session. My pronouns are he, him, and I'll start with a brief audio description of myself for anyone who would find it useful. So I'm white, Irish, male, I have a beard, I'm wearing a blue shirt, cream trousers, clear-rimmed glasses, red hair, and cis presenting. Okay, so the Wellcome Collection is a free museum and library that aims to challenge how we all think and feel about health by connecting science, medicine, life, and art. Wellcome is a global charitable foundation that supports science to solve the urgent health challenges facing everyone today. Tonight's event forms part of a programme of events intended to platform current topical research that has been based around the collections at Wellcome. And at the moment, there is a collection that's just opened in plain sight, and I'd encourage you to go and see that as soon as you can. It's really great and topical. So today, Professor Chris Mounsey will be discussing his research on the 18th century blind mathematician Nicholas Saunderson, and I'll introduce Chris and say a bit more about him in a moment. Before we get started, I'm going to briefly run through how we will run the event. We are here in person in the Wellcome Collection, but the event is also being live streamed and will be available to watch again on Wellcome Collection's YouTube channel. Hello to our live stream audience. Your cameras and microphones will be off, but hopefully you can see and hear us. We have live speech to text provided by VoiceBox. You can see the captions behind me here, and the online attendees can also see them on the live stream. This event is British Sign Language interpreted in the room. Our interpreters, Dee and Jeremy, will take it in turns to interpret what is discussed in BSL. We will be audio describing this event. The event is an hour long and will feature a presentation by our speaker. There will be an opportunity also to ask questions. This is an interactive event, and we'd love to hear from you during Chris's talk. If you're here in person, please raise your hand and we'll hand you a microphone. Or if you'd rather not ask verbally or to be heard by the online live stream audience or in the recording, please speak to a member of staff after the event. For those online, you can chat, comment, and ask questions for the Q&A throughout in the YouTube chat. This is also a safe space. So, of course, tonight we want everyone to have a positive experience, and we want to create a safe space for people to share their ideas. So please interact in person or online responsibly and respectfully. You are encouraged to participate in Wellcome Collection's events, but are requested to be respectful to other participants and speakers, performers, and not to use inappropriate, defamatory, abusive, obscene, racist, discriminatory, or otherwise inflammatory remarks. If you're online and struggling with the platform or have a question, please comment in the chat box and our Wellcome Collection moderators will get in touch. You will need to have a YouTube login to use the chat function. So now I'm just going to say a little bit about our speaker. Chris Mounsey is a professor of 18th century English literature at Winchester University and has special interests in the histories of sexualities and disabilities. He's really world-renowned in the area of the history of sexuality and the history of disability. Before Chris's vision was impaired, he wrote and directed a number of plays. At the same time, he organised the annual conference for the British Society for 18th Century Studies and edited their journal, moving it to an online format with John Wiley, Ltd. Chris also co-organised the Queer People series of conferences at Christ's College, Cambridge, and the Variabilities conferences at Emory University, Atlanta, and Winchester. And tonight, Chris is joined by Stan Booth. Over to you, Chris.
Hello there. I won't give a description of myself because that would be rather difficult. What I want to do is speak extremely quickly and pass over to Stan, and I need to explain why that is. Teaching in higher education, which is what I do most of, is usually done by lecture followed by a seminar. Now, the word lecture means a reading, and it's a reading of a paper. And what Nicholas Saunderson did was he wrote lectures, but of course he was working before the time of Braille, so he couldn't read those lectures out. I lost my sight too late really to learn Braille, and there are other technologies that help me with my lack of sight. So when I give lectures, I'm not reading either, and I think maybe you can see I'm not looking down to my notes in case if I could even see them. After the lecture, there is always a seminar, and I think the most important thing to remember is that the seminar is the best part of the teaching experience. It's when you get to ask your questions and when you get to talk and put us on the spot. In want of me reading you the lecture, Stan is going to read the lecture. Now, every time he uses the word I, he actually means me, okay? It's slightly confusing, but we've been doing it now for 12 years, and we know what we're talking about, and hopefully very shortly you will know what we're talking about. Shut up, Chris. Go on, Stan. Thank you very much.
Right. It was only in the mid-19th century that the term disabled became intransitive. What I mean is, it was only then that society followed the practice of the army and excluded people like me with impairments from work. Sorry. Until then, we were understood transitively. Sorry, it's my northernness, I apologise. Okay. It was only in the mid-19th century that the term disabled became intransitive. What I mean is, it was only then that society followed the practice of the army and excluded people like me with impairments from work. Until then, we were understood transitively as disabled from getting our bread, meaning that for the period of our transition, our coming to terms with our acquired impairment, we were expected to pull our weight however we may. Think of Horatio Nelson, an able seaman who continued to serve on active duty with one eye and one arm. He was not alone in the Navy. Many ship surgeons, for example John Atkins, have written up cases of named officers and able seamen, whom they treated with amputations and for gunshot wounds, which might have rendered them disabled in the modern sense, but did not stop them from getting their bread aboard ships of the line. If only things were so clear-cut now. You acquire an impairment, you adapt, and you continue to be a functioning member of society, though in a different way from before. I noticed that I had problems with my sight in 2008, at which my university asked me whether I was going to take early retirement and presumably listen to daytime TV and become an alcoholic. Only 2 years later, when the Equality Act of 2010 was passed, did I begin to feel safe at work, as I could no longer be asked to resign because of some perceived insurmountable obstacle caused by my inability to see very well. This is not to say that my colleagues were not generally very helpful and kind, but let me assure you, when you feel that people are being helpful and kind to you, you also feel that, firstly, they don't believe you have an impairment, and secondly, they don't believe you're pulling your weight. This is not paranoia, but based on my experience, though let us not go there with the specifics. Rather, I'd like to argue that sighted people are scared of blind people. Every day, I am laughed at in the streets. It's a dead giveaway that I am blind because I carry a white stick. Why this causes the degree of mirth it does took a while to understand. But after 15 years of stick carrying and constant daily abuse, I have decided that it is not some twisted humour about my predicament that brings on the laughter, but a sudden sickening feeling in the observer, who laughs because they realise that they too might just become the person carrying the white stick. They might be the blind person. Sight is so fragile. I want to develop these two ideas into the two themes of this talk. Firstly, working as a blind person, its trials and innovations. What has become an ingrained way of thinking in current UK society is that people with impairments should be the subject of charity, and that we will typically hold out our hands for benefits. Please note that I do not use the term disabled people, because I will not be described by a negative that suggests people who are sighted are somehow marvellously abled, while I am not. Nothing is farther from the truth. I can read faster than you, and so I read a novel every day, which is useful for a professor of literature. Also, with a little help from Steve Jobs, I can mark student essays quicker than anyone else in my university. But I am not some species of supercrip, just an ordinary blind person who has learned to work in different ways, some of which make me more efficient than sighted people. And the second theme, recording the life of a blind person, and the larger problem of trying to understand someone whose experience you cannot know. If you are sighted, you cannot know what it is like not to see. Blindness is not just closing your eyes or tying on a blindfold. It is a 24-hour thing, a dream of life from which you do not awake. This is an illustration of another major problem that I would argue besets our society at all levels. The fact that we tend to believe that everyone understands things the same way that we do. We do not think about reading a book. You sighted people read by looking at type on paper. You can skim and miss out bits. You can turn back a page and read the passage again. You look at the paragraph beginning. We blind people listen to audio text, either created by a computer voice or performed by an actor. Skipping backwards and forwards is possible, but it's a random affair based on units of time, not paragraphs. Click back and you can turn up almost anywhere. The experience is wholly different, if equally valid, but the differences mean, for example, I find it hard to get characters' names into my head by sound alone. They come out as an unfamiliar sound pattern, not like the word that you cited learned from the typographical representation on the page, even if you cannot pronounce it. So I fumble about trying to remember the name when I'm discussing the book with you. So if I fumble about trying to remember a name when I'm discussing the book with you, do help me out. Respect me and do not laugh at me. I am the same, only different from you. My experience does not reduce itself to yours. This is what I call variability, and its term I use instead of disability. All we blind people are different from you sighted, but all we blind are also blind in different ways, just as all you sighted people see in different ways. However you try to describe a colour to someone else without using its form, it's the same colour as. Yet we blind are called blind, and you sighted people think you are ordinary. In fact, we're all blind and sighted, the same, only different. We are all individuals and should be treated with the same respect, not as blind people or sighted people, but as individual, variable people. The same, only different. Variability is an attitude of mind based on interpersonal respect. It is also a rigorous methodology, both of which ideas I shall try to exemplify today. Since I'm a historian, I would explore these two themes and the ideas of variability through the life and work of Nicholas Saunderson, the fourth Lucasian Professor of Mathematics at Cambridge University, who lived between 1711 and 1739, who also lost both his eyes to smallpox when he was a year old. I am engaged in writing the first full-length biography of Nicholas with my access to work partner Stan Booth and my good friend Matt Caffey of Wofford College, South Carolina. Stan makes sure all the words go in the right order and that we find the evidence, and Matt does the mathematics since I count on my fingers. A statement of facts before we start. Nicholas Saunderson was born at Filston, Yorkshire, in January of 1682. His parents were John and Anne Saunderson, and his father was an exciseman. When he lost his sight through smallpox, his father noticed Nicholas had a facility in arithmetic. And young Nicholas helped his father with his accounts. Nicholas proved more gifted in mathematics than his father, who brought in a number of tutors, including Thomas Nettleton, but the student proved too advanced for any ad hoc tuition. In 1702, he attended the Dissenting Academy at Attercliffe, near Sheffield, to learn logic and metaphysics. But here too, he was more advanced in mathematics than his tutors, and spent more time teaching other students than learning. His attendance at a dissenting academy placed him outside the Anglican Church, the official state religion of England at the time. Being an Anglican, he was required to attend either Oxford or Cambridge University. Nevertheless, Nicholas was introduced to Cambridge University by a neighbour, Joshua Dunn, a fellow commoner at Christ College. Here, Nicholas resided and gave public lectures in mathematics to students from other colleges. This practice was not unprecedented, but his lectures were so successful that when William Wisdom was expelled from the Lucasian Chair of Mathematics on the 30th of October of 1710 for religious heresy against the Anglican faith, after a 6-4 vote by the heads of the colleges, Queen Anne granted Nicholas a Master of Arts degree on the 19th of November 1711, so that he would be eligible to succeed Wisdom as Lucasian Professor. He was created the fourth Lucasian Professor the next day, perhaps the first dissenter to be knowingly employed at the university. Nicholas remained resident at Christ College until 1723, when he married Abigail Dickens, daughter of William Dickens, who was the rector of Boxworth in Cambridgeshire. They lived in Cambridge with their children, John and Anne. Nicholas was created Doctor of Laws in 1728 by command of George II, during a visit by the monarch to Cambridge. Nicholas died of scurvy on the 19th of April in 1739, and was buried in the chancel of the parish church at Boxworth. If you check out the histories of mathematics, you'll find hardly a mention of Nicholas Saunderson, though he was very influential in his own time. Here we go. His Elements of Algebra was published in 1740 for the benefits of his wife and children, and became a standard school textbook for mathematics. More importantly, for his contemporary fame, he was the hero of Denis Diderot's Lettre sur les Auvergles of 1749, and translated in 1770. The Lettre on blindness, for the use of those who can see, was an early attempt to challenge religious views of the universe, presenting Nicholas as the advocate of a godless Newtonian materialist world. Just before the Lettre on the Blind was published in English, a searing attack on Nicholas was published in the Bibliographica Britannica of 1766, with veiled claims of sexual irregularities made against him, which have been often repeated and remained unquestioned until this lecture today. So, if we move on to the first bit, which is a blind man at work, his teaching. There we go. Right. We have a contemporary short account of Nicholas in a life, which was appended to the beginning of his algebra, and which was published separately a year later in 1741. It gives a complex and carefully veiled account of Saunderson's education at Attercliffe, and passes silently over his conversion, or not, to Anglicanism, so he could be a professor at Cambridge. The rest centres on his character as a lecturer. It is a compilation of the experience of Saunderson from two students, drawn together by a third, Richard Davies. And we first hear how successful Nicholas was. His lecture, as soon opened, was attended by many from several other colleges, and in some time was so crowded that he could hardly divide the day amongst all who were desirous of his instruction. The explanation the life gives for Saunderson's popularity derives from an understanding of mathematics as the science most adapted to the blind. The ideas of extended quantity, which are the chief objects of mathematics, may as well be acquired from the sense of feeling as that of sight. that it is a fixed and steady attention in the principal qualification for this study, and that the blind are more abstracted than others, we shall perhaps find reason to think there is no other branch of science more adapted to their circumstances. For Davis and his friends, mathematics is presented not as an empirical science in which calculations are made from observations, but one based in pure thought from which the information of vision can only prove a distraction. Being abstracted, that is, unaware of his surroundings, the blind Saunderson was the better mathematician, since he was able to make calculations in his mind without being disturbed. Here too, we discover the reason for Diderot's choice of Saunderson as the herald of a godless Newtonian universe, the substitution of one set of sense data, i.e. sight, for another, that of touch, which allowed Saunderson to understand the world more clearly and rigorously than sighted people. Where sight might be baffled by incorrect visual impressions or optical illusions, touch could only be of real physical material objects. Following both ideas, the life provides us with a piece of first-hand information from Nicholas himself. It was an observation frequently made by our professor that diagrams, which are intended only as a help to the imagination, are often the means of misleading the judgment. It is certain, however useful they may be to the learner, yet the inventor must in all cases proceed without them. The scheme be erected in his imagination, in circumstances as general as the proposition, such as cannot be delineated upon paper. As Saunderson makes the observation about the poverty of diagrams, he raises the idea that diagrams have to be erected in the imagination in order that the calculation moves from the particular case of the lines on paper to the general rule. This suggests that some kind of spatial thinking underlines the process of geometrical reasoning. I use the term spatial thinking to recalibrate the idea of geometry as the science of pencil lines on paper, which we all still learn in school, and replace this thinking with the idea of triangles and other figures in the imagination. Nicholas could not draw on paper and see the lines. Instead, he used this board and showed his students triangles with pieces of string looped around pins dropped in appropriate places. Nicholas could feel the triangles, and it was feeling that brought them to his mind rather than pencil and paper, I should say. He was doing the same thing, only in a different way, by touch and not sight. Both ways of moving from sense data to thought are examples of spatial thinking, because each begins with an accurate form and ends with an exact idea. For Nicholas, and what he taught his students was that geometry was the making of a spatial representation in the mind from which inward calculations could be made, rather than from measurements on a page or board. What is important here is that each method, by sight or by touch, is the same, only different from one another. Blind and sighted mathematicians can reach the same conclusions. The information just gets into minds in different ways. That Nicholas could use it to teach his students is an example of learning from a blind teacher, and may account for why Nicholas was a successful teacher. He helped his students to think in a different way. Likewise, we learn from this statement by Saunderson that although Diderot would like it that touch conveyed the material world more perfectly to Nicholas than the diagram did to a sighted mathematician, mathematics was nevertheless a practice that goes on in the mind. Where Diderot spends a considerable time in the Lettre on the Blind explaining palpable arithmetic, that is, on how Saunderson used the board to make calculations and work out problems using pins dropped into holes, and by which he was able, on these subjects, to convey the clearest ideas to his pupils. The process of conveying the ideas to the students is ultimately by thought and not touch. What Sanderson had found was a different way to communicate the ideas of his mind to those of his students. Vital too is that this is fully consonant with Isaac Newton's stricture in the introduction to the Principia Mathematica. That is, there we go. The ancients considered mechanics in a twofold respect, as rational, which proceeds accurately by demonstration, and practical. To practical mechanics, all the manual arts belong, from which mechanics took its name. But as artificers do not work with imperfect accuracy, it comes to pass that mechanics is so distinguished from geometry. That is, what is perfectly accurate is called geometrical. What is less so is called mechanical. But the errors are not in the art, but in the artificers. He that works with less accuracy is an imperfect mechanic, as if any could work with perfect accuracy. He would be the most perfect mechanic of all. Saunderson's statement about the poverty of diagrams was attempting to inculcate into his students that what is perfectly accurate is called geometrical, and accuracy is more perfect in the mind than in diagrams on a pinboard or on papers in both, in both of which inaccuracies are tend to be brought in by the artificers. As an account of his educational practice of getting things into the mind of his students, this was invaluable. And it was one which was taken up again and again for hundreds of years after his death. So vibrant was his memory of Saunderson's method of teaching that Richard Davis remembered it until his death, writing in an open letter to Stephen Hales in 1759 about the poor state of education and the lectures, in particular, at Cambridge University. It is probable that the lectures at first established to be read from the professorial chairs were in some future period found to be more ostentatious than useful, and therefore became equally neglected by hearers and teachers. But we have some instances that demonstrate the advantage of lecturers. There a plan is laid that comports to mutual interest. Professor Dickens taught the civil law and Professor Saunderson the mathematics to numerous classes of scholars in private lectures annually. These gentlemen were esteemed the brightest ornaments of the university. If, like Nicholas's predecessor, William Whiston, you begin to first lecture with a diagram of conic section and an equation for calculating its surface area, you were just being ostentatious. The diagrams looked good but conveyed little to students. If you begin, as Nicholas did, with a problem about dividing up a bar bill after some of the drinkers have run away, you could take your students with you from there to the inner world of mathematics. Davis expatiates further on the clarity of Nicholas's method of teaching. Mathematics are now more commonly understood than in Nicholas's time, and many excellent books have rendered the study more expeditious. Yet, by his peculiar felicity in teaching, he laid the subject open and familiar to the minds of learners, that their capacities were daily expanded and enlarged to receive a comprehensive view of things. Above all, a reverential regard for the truth as the great law of the God of truth. If not a direct attack on Christianity, it was most certainly an attack on the way Christian structures and methodologies continue to dominate the universities to the exclusion of the inductive empirical study of science. Likewise, that even in this age, indulgent it is to conscientious liberty, no person is yet permitted to take the lowest degree in the study of arts, or those in music, law, or physics, as well as divinity, unless he will subscribe to the 39 Articles of the Church of England. The point seems to be a comment upon Nicholas's own education in mathematics at Attercliffe Academy. Likewise, we can feel Saunderson's example hidden beneath Davis's argument about the university's requirements that its staff were in holy orders. The humour of giving establishment in the universities to clergymen only has forced into the world many men of a speculative turn and freedom of thought, who do not like to confine themselves to any profession, but would have chosen rather to shun the world. Such geniuses might have best exercised themselves in the collegiate retirement, where they might have given birth to several useful inventions and have risen up teachers in many branches of speculative science. Instead, Davis argued that there should be public lecturers and professors in some art or science. They should be perpetual, be allowed to marry and to reside at large in the university, and to make profit from their lecture. Davis's desired change in academic practices at the university appears to have been modelled on the career of Nicholas Saunderson, who was a religiously dissenting scientist who best exercised himself in collegiate retirement, was married and profited from his lectures. But this was possible for him only because he was blind. We blind people need others to help us take care of ourselves. We need our nails cutting and help crossing roads. Nicholas's choice to marry Abigail Dickens was apparently based on their love and respect for one another. But it is also a practical way for blind people to live with someone who can help him with his day-to-day intimacies. That most academics at the university are now able to marry is another lesson learned from a blind man. But this is not all we know about Nicholas's teaching methods. He wrote, presumably with an amanuensis, probably Abigail, a set of lectures on Newtonian science, of which about a dozen manuscript copies are still in existence, one of which is here at the Wellcome Library. These lectures are perfect notes of Newton's method applied to different fields of studies. They are intended to explain Newton's Principia Mathematica and to be copied out by students in more or less best copperplate. There we go. What is interesting about these sets of notes is that even today, the existence of a cheat sheet for mathematics students is still commonplace. They shall remain nameless, but one friend who studied mathematics at Oxford bemoaned the fact that there was not such a guide available, while another who studied at the University of Tennessee told me they were the reason he enjoyed learning mathematics and became a professor. We believe they were not part of the actual teaching sessions he ran, because there are another set of lecture notes. Professor Saunderson's lecture notes, taken by Duncan Gaines of Pembroke College, which are here in the Wellcome Library, and which described in a very untidy hand a lecture at which one Mr. Williams, the demonstrator, surely Saunderson's own Stan, performs experiments with buckets of water and such like. If we move on to the concept, onto Saunderson's ideas, it therefore may or may not be a coincidence that Saunderson's mathematical teaching influenced one of the more practical developments in 18th century science. Davis Sobel tells us in her book Longitude that John Harrison, the creator of the precision clocks that first allowed the calculation of longitude, copied out Saunderson's lectures from a manuscript lent to him by a clergyman. The manuscript was almost certainly one of the many fair copies of Saunderson's lecture notes, rather than the algebra copied out, as I first thought, and the fact he chose them as probably because they were thought of as the best interpretation of Newton. Another student who attended Saunderson's lecture was philosopher David Hartley. We find a direct filiation from Nicholas in a number of details which occur in Hartley's most famous work, Observations on Man, His Frame, His Duty and His Expectations. Described as a neurophysiology constructed on the basis of Newtonian speculative physics, the most important aspect of Hartley's part philosophical, part religious work is called decomplexivity, which explains how we learn to carry out complex activities with our hands, such as typing and playing the piano. What Hartley argues is that we can learn things we repeat and then do them without thinking. That is, without watching our hands do them, which is just what Nicholas did when he used his calculating board. It is also in Hartley's book that Nicholas is mentioned as the mathematician who developed Bayes' theorem. And since the theorem was not associated with Bayes until 1760, and Hartley's book was published in 1749, then we ought to perhaps rename Bayes' theorem Saunderson's projection. In the same way, it is not surprising that Saunderson's Elements of Algebra of 1740 was taken up by Visimus Knox, headmaster of Tonbridge School and inventor of the liberal education system, which became the standard of British public schools in the 19th century. In essays Moral and Literary, Knox writes lugubriously of mathematical education. He who is compelled by necessity or inclination to attend to logic may with propriety neglect all the rubbish of the schools, and next to the Stagyrite himself, that of Aristotle, study only the works of Saunderson, Wallis, Watson, Harris. The algebra went into numerous editions in the 18th century and was followed by a number of abbreviated versions for school use. To conclude this section, it seems unassailable that Nicholas should be remembered for clear and easy ways of explaining to young mathematicians the ideas of Archimedes and Euclid, Newton and Cotes, and even Whiston, whose theorem had a design to perplex, and that he taught with reference to the real world, and that he taught with reference to real world situations. It is perhaps this that was Saunderson's greatest achievement in the teaching of mathematics. So much so, the life records that his inclination led him to those parts of the mathematics which are not the most abstracted, and that end only in contemplation. A proposition must have its uses in order to engage his attention. So, if we move on to the next section, which is how do we record the life of a blind person? In this section, I want to explore the nature of the sources of information about Nicholas Saunderson that I have just used to construct the idea of him as a teacher. Much of the information was based on the life appended to the algebra, whose authors, despite holding a variety of beliefs about religion and science, had one thing in common. They were all sighted. Whether six-sighted men could understand the life of one blind man and how he thought is open to question. The idea that they could understand the blind man's experience of the world from their collective, but all-sighted, understanding of inductive empiricism might seem reciprocally possible. If, as Denis Diderot claimed in his essay on the blind, Saunderson read lectures on optics, the nature of light and colours, and explained the theory of vision, the effects of glasses, the phenomena of the rainbow, and several other points relating to sight and its organ. And could not the sighted explain the blind man's world? I do not use the term shed light upon the blind man's world, a typical visual metaphor, since the fact that Nicholas lost both his eyes to smallpox before the end of his first year, and that meant he had no conscious memory of light. But I do not want to lose the thread of my argument in the tendency of language to the visual metaphor. There are enough words to describe everything without reference to knowledge gained from sight. There must be, as Nicholas Saunderson did not experience sight, but could still describe it. And this leads me to the method in which I believe we might accurately read Nicholas. In the diverse consciousness of a number of people who have enough experiences and specific knowledges to form an accurate understanding of the blind man's experience of the world, this is a methodology of variability, the way in which we can get into the head of someone whose experience we cannot know. We need to process enough experiences from diverse sources which witness the subject. in the remembrance of the consciousness that we are in the same, only different from the subject. This might be enough upon which to found not the truth about Nicholas, but something approaching it. What is also important is that we have heard two approaches to Nicholas's life, and I shall now separate them in order to examine the value. So, if we start with the friends, I have already quoted at length from the three students, but there were three other contributors to the life appended to the algebra, who might be thought of as Nicholas's own teachers. In all, the six were Dr. Thomas Nettleson of Halifax, Dr. Richard Wilkes of Wolverhampton, the Reverend Mr. John Bolderow, late Fellow of Christ College, the Reverend Mr. Gervis Holmes, late Fellow of Emmanuel College, the Reverend Mr. Granville Wheeler, and Dr. Richard Davies of Shrewsbury, late Fellow of Queen's College. The six friends fall into two groups. The first, Saunderson students, Wilkes, Wheeler and Davis, all wrote scientific works that follow an empirical methodology, which might suggest they learned this new technique from their teacher. The second group, Saunderson's own teachers and colleagues, are a bit more difficult to understand from this distance, as they left behind them either very little or a complex method or a complex message about their methodologies and beliefs. If we can learn anything about ourselves as teachers from the writing of our students, it must be granted that such recovery can only be possible if the students cover the widest possible period of our careers, and that they either agree on a methodological approach or demonstrate a linked development in our thinking from student to student. Thus, and Saunderson's use of the inductive method suggests it, as we have only a very small sample of his students, we can only speculate on what Saunderson thought. However, in the event, these three students cover the full range of Saunderson's time at Cambridge, and all agree on an inductive empirical approach to the diverse subject matter of their own contributions to knowledge. All are Newtonians. So, if we move on to Nicholas's students, Dr. Richard Wilkes of Wolverhampton was admitted pensioner at St. John's College, Cambridge, aged 19, on the 13th of March 1709. Whereafter, he practised medicine in his hometown of Willenhall, near Walsall in Staffordshire, and called himself MD, although we have yet to find the evidence of his qualification to use the title. There is no doubt, however, where he stood on matters of scientific methodology, as he prefixed his An Historical Essay on the Dropsy with a clear statement of Newtonian deductive empiricism. When we talk of the nature of things and frame arguments from thence a priori, as they are called, we are all in the dark, and such arguments must be true or false purely as they are supported or contradicted by particular matters of fact. Induction is the only sure way we have of coming at truth. Our local history website records that Wilkes studied theology and obtained a BA in January 1715, followed by an MA. He became proficient in algebra after beginning a course of maths lectures in April 1711 that were given by Saunderson. From 1715, he taught mathematics at Cambridge, and in 1718 became a fellow of the college. Although the Cambridge University alumni website then does not record it, the same local historian claims Wilkes was ordained deacon of the parish of Stow by Chartley in Staffordshire between Stafford and Uttoxeter. He preached once at St. Peter's Church in Wolverhampton, but became disillusioned with the established church and never took priest's orders. Immediately, we might stop and think, a local history website, why might this be trusted? All this uncredited information may come from Wilkes's diary, the second volume of which is here at the Wellcome Library, but the volume notes the loss of the first. We have firmer evidence that Wilkes, enriched by two marriages, took a full part in town life in Willenhall, was the founder of the workhouse, and was involved closely in rebuilding the parish church, whereupon he became its warden, though he refused to be ordained or become its vicar. He was too much of a scientist, a godless materialist, in the way Diderot classed Nicholas. The balance between science and Anglican in the Reverend Mr. Granville Wheeler is irreproachable. His scientific advancement is expressed in his rapid rise through the academic ranks. Yes, at the time he was an ordained deacon and priest of St. Margaret's, Westminster, and was ordained deacon and priest at St. Margaret's, Westminster on the 25th of September 1737, and was admitted as rector of Leek, Nottinghamshire in 1737, where he remained until 1770, and in respect of which he became prebendary of Southwell Minster in 1753, remaining until 1770. At the same time, Wheeler was author of 6 short papers on electricity, 1 on an eclipse, and 1 on the rotary motion of glass tubes, all presented at the Royal Society. The high point of Wheeler's scientific career was that, to Wheeler fell the fame of being the first in England to electrify a live animal. He succeeded in leading electricity through the bodies of live chickens, then through the footboy, a good stout lad, whom he suspended by a silk rope, touching his hand or foot with a long glass rod that had previously rubbed so as to bear a charge, and making another person point to the baby's face or hand, whereupon sparks crackled between the two, and they felt a burning sensation. It was for this experiment that Wheeler was elected to the Royal Society. In the case of Dr. Richard Davis of Shrewsbury, Fellow of Queen's College, who collected the Friends' recollections on Nicholas and wrote up the life, the balance, like that of Wilkes, weighs more heavily away from Anglicanism in his pursuit of the great law of the God of truth. He was elected Fellow of the Royal Society in 1738, where he presented a long paper of tables on the specific gravities of elements, in which he gathered his information from diverse sources, in the inductive empirical fashion, and called for a uniform method of measurement so comparisons might be made. More important to the present purpose was Davis's continuation of the work of William Harvey on human blood, in which he also follows the inductive empirical methodology of his fellow students. The first principles of medical knowledge ought to be founded upon observations, and chiefly on such as are made by an attention to examination of the most obvious phenomena, in which nature is put out as little of her usual course. So those were the students. If we move on to his teachers, oops, gone a bit quick there. As a man without formal qualification, we have already heard that Nicholas is recorded to have been granted an MA by Queen Anne and created Lucasian Professor the next day. Yet, it cannot be doubted that he would have needed continued support from the university's Regent House, that is, the body of teaching masters and the chief legislative body of the university, particularly at the beginning of his tenure of the professorship. This was probably led by the first of the older friends who helped compile his life. The Reverend Mr. John Boldero, Fellow of Christ Church, was proctor in the academic years 1713 to 1714, and therefore worked within the university's governing body for the academic year before and the one after Saunderson's appointment. Boldero adds to the religious aspects of Nicholas's friends, being ordained deacon at Ely in 1697 and priest in 1698. He was the vicar of Fendrayton in Cambridgeshire from 1707 to 1713 and rector of Clipstone and Dingley, Northamptonshire from 1713 to 1751. In the only publication of his I can locate, an assize sermon, The Nature and Duty of Justice, he reminds the justices that for the welfare and security of all governments in general, and the peace and prosperity of every community in general, it is necessary to hear the small as well as the great. Thomas Nettleton of Halifax is probably the source in the life of information about Saunderson's early years and his education at Attercliffe. Nettleton was educated in Halifax Grammar School, then at Edinburgh University and Leiden for his MD, whereafter he practiced medicine in Halifax. This sends a firm message about his methodology in science, but mixed messages about his religion. A grammar school suggests an Anglican background, and Edinburgh Presbyterian. Leiden reminds us of the failure of the English universities to accommodate their studies to the general wants of the living. But the decision not to go to Oxford or Cambridge might add to the belief he was a dissenter. Of Nettleton's scientific methodology, A.W. Bolston tells us that he was a firm practitioner of the inductive empirical method. Thomas Nettleton was one of the first, possibly the first, to use quantitative assessments of the effects of medical interventions. In December 1721, during the epidemics of smallpox in West Yorkshire, Nettleton collected statistics on the mortality associated with naturally acquired smallpox and compared these with mortality following variolation. Nettleton's findings on variolation, that is, an early form of inoculation for smallpox, was presented to the Royal Society in 5 papers. The first of which calls for other work in the same field to pool their findings to increase the accuracy of the conclusions. If the man who brought Saunderson into the world of academia was perhaps a dissenter, the man who took him out of it was clearly Anglican, although Gervase-Holmes's views on science are hidden from us. Holmes might have been one of Saunderson's students, as he was admitted Sizer at Emmanuel College, Cambridge, on the 24th of March 1715. But with no record of scientific experiments, we cannot be certain. He was ordained deacon at Ely in 1724 and priest in 1727, whence he became rector of Withersdale, Suffolk, and finally vicar of Fresingfield, Suffolk, from 1738 until his death in 1776. Holmes is a difficult person to track, as he published nothing and had 3 relatives of the same name, all of whom studied at Emmanuel College. It would appear that he could be called a traditionalist in religion, since what we do know of him is that he subscribed to 3 commentaries on apocryphal biblical texts by Richard Arnold. His contemporary at Cambridge, as well as Thomas Orton's Ordico Judicorum, an account of the procedures of the church courts in Latin. We know that it was Gervase-Holmes who attended Saunderson's deathbed, as it is noted in the life. The Reverend Mr. Gervase-Holmes informed him that the mortification gained such ground that his friends could not entertain hope of his recovery. Yet we must ask ourselves whether we shall privilege these 6 men's account of Saunderson's life. Each had a different view of what the truth was, scientific or religious, and all were accounted Nicholas's friends. But whom can we believe? A religious metaphor comes to mind. Like Jesus' disciples, the 6 all knew their subject. However, the 3 synoptic gospels containing anomalies in their accounts of Jesus' life. With this in mind, we might read Nicholas in the life of the work as of 6 different men with 6 different ways of understanding, and try our best to reach out and touch the blind man and his experience through their partial, in both meanings of the word, experience. We will not find the whole truth about what it was like to be Nicholas Saunderson, but we might find a bit of it. There we go. So if we move on to Diderot's influence. The other source of information about Nicholas's life, as we heard above, is Denis Diderot's Lettre on the Blind, for the use of those who can see, in which Nicholas's abilities are marvelled at, and whose deathbed conversation with Gervase-Holmes, the most religious of his friends, is recounted in great detail for the purpose of demonstrating that he held atheist and materialist beliefs. Another partial, in both senses of the word, account, you might think, and from which we might extend the religious metaphor, is that, like St. Paul and Jesus, Denis Diderot never met Nicholas Saunderson, yet passed on important information which has informed the understanding of future generations. Yet Diderot's evidence came to him via a complex trail, and one we can follow. Diderot's word-for-word account of the deathbed discussion between Gervase-Holmes and Nicholas is derived from a source supposed to be one William Inchcliffe, a work printed in Dublin in 1747 under the title of The Life and Character of Dr. Nicholas Saunderson by his disciple and friend William Inchcliffe, Esquire. The title is very similar to the separate publication of the Memoirs of the Life and Character of Dr. Nicholas Saunderson, late Lucasian Professor of Mathematics in the University of Cambridge, collected from his oldest and most intimate acquaintance by Dr. Richard Davis of Shrewsbury of 1741, which was printed at the University Press in Cambridge. A typical strategy in 18th century advertising, this book was a reprint of the life prefixed to Saunderson's Algebra of 1740, which was also printed at the University Press in Cambridge. But no copy of the Inchcliffe Life and Character has ever been found, and nor does it appear to have existed, whether or not Inchcliffe did. From where Diderot got his ideas about Inchcliffe is uncertain, but a letter dated Dean Chard, Westminster, August 17, 1749, from the historian Thomas Cart to one Zachary Gray, is preserved in Nicholas's illustrations of the literary history of the 18th century. Cart asks of Gray, where and when did Nicholas Saunderson die? Did he declare himself an atheist or a Pyrrhonian? A skeptic, a man who doubted of the very first principles of nature and revealed religion at his last hour, and did he die in this opinion? Was a minister by name Gervase Holmes, a learned divine, called to assist him, silenced by the strength of Saunderson's argument on that point? Has there ever been printed in England or the late years a book with the following title, The Life and Character of Dr. Nicholas Saunderson, late Lucasian Professor of Mathematics in the University of Cambridge, by his disciple and friend William Inchcliffe, Esquire? The letter looks innocent enough, and the questions are without doubt derived from either reading, or were source material for the composing of Diderot's Lettre. Cart is addressing Gray because the latter worked each winter in Cambridge after 1729, and presumably knew of Nicholas and his friends. Who Cart's friends might be for whom he is asking the questions is not clear, and there is no known reply extant from Gray. However, with respect to the beliefs of the correspondence, the letter is framed with other meanings. Cart was Jacobite, who was exiled for associating with the old Pretender bishop, Francis Atterbury. Cart returned to England in 1728 on the plea of Richard Meade, the king's physician, but never threw off his belief in the Stuart cause. He knew Dublin, and in the 1730s suppressed a pirated edition of his own life of the Duke of Ormond, which was published there. The fact that he asked whether Gray knows of an English publication of the Saunderson's Life by Inchcliffe suggests that he believed that the Dublin publication of 1747 might also be a pirate, and is asking whether the original had been published in Cambridge. Adding to the complexity of this thread of information, Zachary Gray was a high Anglican controversialist who wrote vehemently against dissenters and against science. In 1736, Gray published an attack on Isaac Newton, an examination of Sir Isaac Newton's observations upon the prophecies of Daniel, in which the author's notion to the rise and cause of saint worship is carefully considered and disapproved. Bearing this in mind, Nicholas Saunderson, a pro-Newtonian and probably dissenter, or at least a man associated with dissent, is not simply the subject of a series of biographical enquiries, but it would appear Cart is setting up for an attack by Gray, or by someone who shared Cart and Gray's dislike of Newton, scientists and dissenters. It will not be out of the question, therefore, to believe that Gray wrote the attack on Nicholas, which appeared in the Biographica Britannica of 1766, and published for the first time in England the idea of Saunderson's deist views. Whoever wrote it will seem to know or have read Diderot's Lettre, and in French it was not translated, and the letter was in French, but not translated until 1770. He received the notice of his approaching death with great calmness and serenity, and after a short silence, resuming life and spirit, he talked as much composure as usual. He was not supposed to entertain any great notion of revealed religion, yet we are told he appointed to receive the sacrament the evening before his death, which a delirium that never went off prevented him from doing so. It is also this article that makes the unprecedented accusation of Saunderson's character. Like his predecessor Whiston, he uttered his sentiments of men not only freely, but licentiously, with a kind of contempt and disregard for decency and common sense, and which is worse, he indulged himself in women, wine, and profound swearing to a shocking excess, by which means he did more to hurt the reputation of the mathematics than he did good by his eminent skill in science. Were the comment not prefixed with phrases like his predecessor Whiston, we might consider this to be university gossip with an element of truth behind it, if not accuracy. However, the fact that Whiston was expelled from Cambridge for heresy against the Anglican Church while Saunderson was not, suggests strongly that the article was meant to tarnish Saunderson's reputation and has done so until this lecture. John Nichols brought Zachary Gray's papers in 1772, and with the publication of Carte's letter to Gray in 1880, Diderot soon became the accepted version of the atheist blind mathematician. Only 6 years after the publication of Carte's letter, George Dyer, a radical and a dissenter, wrote of Saunderson, "He obtained his degree and rank in the university out of the usual order, and was appointed Lucasian Professor of Mathematics in the room of Whiston, the latter being deprived for some religious opinions, and Saunderson being no friend to divine revelation, in like manner as Dr. Haley, Professor of Astronomy at Oxford. Saunderson's contemporary, it was remarked, that as Whiston was set aside on account of too much religion, Saunderson was preferred for having none at all." The idea that Nicholas was no friend to divine revelation has its source in Carte's letter to Gray, and Diderot spread the idea throughout Europe. So, if we come to a conclusion, the two streams of evidence we now have to help us understand the life of a blind man gives us two different versions of Nicholas. The six friends' accounts make up a story of a genial teacher and a mathematical genius whose work in practice was both a model for other teachers and for the development of university life. Denis Diderot's account, derived from Carte and Gray, instead reads Nicholas from their own standpoint as conservative Anglicans, trying to maintain the tradition of unmarried tutors in Cambridge. Nicholas's life is therefore to be held up as an example of bad practice, and his contribution to mathematics and the development of university life disregarded. Following the methodology of variability, which respects uniqueness, we cannot discount either of these sets of evidence, but this does not mean that we must try to encompass two different versions of Nicholas in one composite life. Rather, as I have hoped to show in this second section, we must explain the sources of evidence and draw our own unique conclusions. So I will not tell you what my preferred version of Nicholas is. It's not important to you. Only your version is important. But let it be based upon an induction from empirical evidence, the ethics of trying to find something true to life, in the faith that it is accurate. I will end with one brief glimpse of Nicholas's life that explains a great deal about his blindness to me, a blind person. When Nicholas met Abigail, it is recorded that she would flutter her eyelashes against his cheeks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris, for a wonderful paper, very rich, a real insight into 18th century studies research, but also bringing the personal into the archive as well, which is such an important part of disability studies. And thanks to Stan for reading it. We do have time for maybe one question. Chris, you spoke about variability, which is a concept that you coined as a disability studies scholar. And the Wellcome Collection subscribes to the social model of disability. So it might be something that we could pick up on, but what I'd like to do now is kind of open it to the floor and to get a sense of a question from the floor. So if anybody has a question, please just raise your hand. If anybody would like to ask a question online, please just put it into the chat box. and we will look at those questions if we have time later. But we have one question over here.
Is this work?
Thank you so much for the first part of your lecture and the second part of your lecture. The first part of your lecture is what I want to ask you about, if I might.
Yes.
And so I'm really interested in what you said about people laughing at you. And so I used to be a lot blinder than I am now, and I used to be a lot more mobile than I am now. And so I don't get people laughing at me. I get people asking me impertinent questions and making assumptions and so on. But my question is really about the way you spoke about it. It felt like blindness was a very special version of disability as far as you were concerned. And is that just because of your personal experience, or is that because you really believe that it is different from other sorts of disability?
Absolutely not at all. Blindness is the disability that I have, the disability I've been coming to terms with for the last 15 years. And as I hope really to, if I'd been able to change the lecture as I was listening to it, I would have spent more time on variability. The idea of variability is that we stop looking for types. We stop looking for types of blind people. We stop looking for people who have reduced mobility. We stop looking for deaf people. We look at individual people and we give them names. That's why throughout the lecture Nicholas was called Nicholas, because to me he's Nicholas, and he was a human being. And he was a human being who had some extraordinary gifts. I have to say, just to give a personal account of my own blindness, I was writing a book and I was intending to write a chapter that was going to be 6,000 words long. It ended up 46,000 words long. And sorry that lecture was so long, but I've learned patience, because I need patience, because my condition means I need to listen to every single word one by one. So of course I'm going to make blindness appear special, because it's what I do. It's the whole change of my life has been because of that. But I'm Chris. Hello, who are you?
I'm Caroline.
Hi, Caroline. Lovely to meet you.
Very nice to meet you too. And I just partly I'm asking the question because there is such a kind of a precedence on visual looking at things, and all these metaphors and so on about it. And some of that is coming out in the exhibition. I haven't seen the exhibition yet, but there's such a big thing about visualness as a primary thing somewhere, and that's why I kind of was asking the question about it.
No, absolutely. And Declan was talking about the social model of disability, which explores disability in terms of the very language we use. Our language, if I say to you, do you see what I mean? I can answer, no, I don't, even though I've used the terminology. Our language is infiltrated by visual metaphors. And I think it's that, as you say, we get asked impertinent questions, and they are impertinent in that both senses of the word, that they are just not pertinent to us, because don't ask me to explain vision. Nicholas could do it, and he did it in some extraordinary ways, and I recommend you have a look at those lectures and to work out how he's done it. And he's doing it solely through mathematics, and he's using one particular language to explain something which he couldn't experience, which of course is what I'm trying to do in the lecture, to say, well, here is the human being. Now, this is how we know about him. How do we understand what we know about him? Because we've got these 6, largely speaking, religious people who accept him and present him as a really wonderful person who changed university life in Cambridge. And then we have some other religious people who hated him and put too much emphasis on Diderot's idea that he was an atheist at a time when being an atheist was not a good idea. And so we've lost Saunderson from history. The chapter that I'm working on at the moment of the book, I've got 46 histories of mathematics that don't even mention his name, although he was probably the most important of the popularizers of Newton. And one of the students who was at Cambridge at the time, when he was teaching, said, look, there goes Saunderson. He's the man who actually explained Newton's nonsense, because no one could understand the Principia Mathematica. And Nicholas managed to do it, and I think he managed to do it because he was, as comes out in the first part of the lecture, he was trying to explain it in a different way. He wasn't trying to explain it as though everybody could see things, because he couldn't see light and colour and the rainbow and so forth. But then people gave him all sorts of just nonsensical capabilities, that they said you could give him a coin and he could rub it between his fingers and tell you whether it was fake or not.
That's ridiculous.
Just ridiculous. Thank you very much for saying. Totally ridiculous. That blind people were not super crips. We're just people who have gone from one way of managing the world to another way of managing the world, which I think might be helpful. Can I ask any of you, have you been taught by a blind teacher? Have any of you been taught by a blind teacher? You've been taught by me. I recognise that voice. And this is how I know my students. This is Imogen over there. And I recognise her from her voice. And she'll tell you at the beginning I get their names wrong. But then when I learn their voices, I can get their names. Would any of you like...
All of us have been taught by a blind teacher. You, because we've just been taught something today.
Thank you very much. How many of you would like to be taught by a blind teacher after what you've heard today?
I want more from you.
Well,
I've got loads more questions to ask you, but I think other people might want some more, and I'm going to sneak up on you at the end and try and talk to you some more.
I think there will be plenty of time to address questions to Chris after the conclusion of the talk. I think we've gone slightly over, so...
It's like we've had one online, so maybe we'll just take that one.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so this question is from John. I'm just going to sit down so I'm not in your way. A question from John Gilmore. Fabulous presentation. Thank you very much, Chris and Stan. I'm pondering whether we see a hierarchy of disablement. The experience of becoming impaired because of a stigmatising illness, smallpox in the case with Saunderson, versus those who become impaired, though through, in inverted commas, natural, stated sarcastically, he says, aging, or indeed are born with impairments. I'm wondering how this might have played out historically versus how it is experienced today.
Yeah, you see, this is where I think variability comes in very nicely. I think in the past there, of course, has been fear and terror of impairments, people born with impairments or people becoming impaired, as though it's some kind of curse from God. Nowadays, I think people understand that that is not the case. But I still think there is a sense of, there's a sense of lacking understanding that we are all individuals and we need to respect each one of us as individuals rather than saying, you're this, you're that, you're the other. You know, whether it's in terms of physicality, impairment, in terms of race, or whatever, that we are all individuals, and it's learning this attitude, the attitude of variability. We are all the same, only different. That I was just saying to Declan, I'm going to retire soon. I'll never retire. I enjoy my work too much. But the one thing I want to be remembered for is variability, and the idea of variability that can be applied to so many different things. And get rid of the idea of hierarchies. We're all just people. We're all just people with names. And that if we remember that we are people and that we respect people, so when somebody does say to me, do you see what I mean? I always say absolutely yes. And then I say to them, but do think about the language that you're using. The first time you and I met, you used a visual metaphor at me, and you said, oh, I shouldn't have said that. Of course you should. It's natural English. It's what we do. And I'm not hurt by it. But you pointed it out to yourself, and I said, don't worry about it. Come on, let's come and see this space. That's what we need to do, to remember that we can remain in dialogue rather than say, oh, well, the people who are going to become impaired because they get old, they're much less important than the people who are born with impairments or whatever, or people who acquire impairments and so forth. And
I suppose it's the systems around the body and impairments that in some way make variability sometimes a challenging idea, because it is a really useful way and a kind of a productive way of thinking about humans and bodies and sameness. And yet, as a pronouncement, often it might come up against a kind of history of difference, that no matter how one can say I'm the same as you, there is a history, a politics,
Yes.
a past
Yes.
that encompasses a different story. So depending where you are in the world, or what kind of regime you're within,
Yes.
we're all held by power to some extent. So
Yes.
it's interesting to kind of think about how then variability might be a way of further thinking through that power.
Exactly. And I think that's why, having developed the idea of disability in using contemporary contexts, I've realized actually it works really nicely in historical contexts, and the historical context of Nicholas Saunderson, where you have two totally different versions of him, each of which is trying to gain power over him, and one of which wins. And I'm here saying, no, come on, we need to remember Nicholas. We need to look at history. We need to look at different contexts. We need to work out our own attitude towards variability within our own contexts, because we all only exist in our own contexts. But as historians, we can look at other contexts and we can learn other things from those other contexts. And I think that's really important to do, and to help other people rethink their own context by showing a particular context. And thank you so much. That was such a long lecture. I hope you enjoyed it as much, listening to it as much as I enjoyed writing it. I hope you realized the reason for going into such tiny details, because the smaller the details are, the more one realizes actually all of this meaning is simply contextual. Repetition of Lucasian Professor of Mathematics in the University of Cambridge comes out like a mantra, because that's how it was. And that Saunderson is remembered in this tiny little context, but he's so important in other contexts. I hope in all of your contexts, and you'll buy the book when it comes out and tell other people about it. And did anyone know, by the way, that there may be a musical on the life of Nicholas Saunderson coming onto the West End stage?
No.
Have you heard about it? It's called No Horizon. It was just about to go onto the West End stage when COVID hit. So hopefully it will appear. I have nothing to do with it. But if it does turn up, let's all go and have a look at it and have a sing-along and so on. We'll meet again next year and we'll have a sing-along version of the lecture.
Well, maybe you'll write about it, maybe.
Then maybe
Yeah.
it'll have to come in.
And your
won't it?
book, Site Correction, that features some work on Nicholas
No,
Saunderson? No, it doesn't?
No, I wrote a book called Site Correction, which came out in 2019, which explored the way sight was philosophized about, and the way it was the subject of surgery and so on. And there was going to be a chapter on Nicholas Saunderson, but just as I said, when I first was confronted with not being able to see very well, a chapter moved from 4,000 words to 36,000 words. Well, the work on Nicholas Saunderson moved from, it should have been a 6,000 word chapter, and I've now got 80,000 words.
Got another book?
So I nearly got another book. It's nearly there. It's nearly
But
there.
people might start with that.
I think Site Correction is
Yeah.
a great book if you're interested in the history of vision. It came out from the University of Virginia Press
Great.
in 2019. That's the ad break. You don't need to.
Right. Well, listen, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I think you've really brought Nicholas Saunderson into our mind's eye and into our consciousness, and given us an opportunity to think through variability, think through different ways of thinking about disability, and importantly, to think about disability in the past. Thank you so much for turning up, for asking questions, for being engaged. And I'll just draw the talk to a close now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.